the big banks, each individually knew that they were broke. And they knew as a consequence of the fact that they were broke, that their counterparties were broke. And so there was no interbank lending. There was no short-term credit. So there was no credit to hedge funds. There was no credit to companies. There was no credit in the commodities chain. And what the government did was, in the context of how they live, the right thing to do. They flooded the market with liquidity. They told the banks, yes, you're broke, but you won't be, right? Yes, you have a solvency issue, but we'll screw them all. We'll put liquidity in. You guys won't go broke. And that's where we are now. The continued response that we're seeing now, that the crisis is, from their point of view, over, is very interesting. They are continuing to provide liquidity. They're doing this really for, I think, 3 reasons. The first reason is that they genuinely are confusing a solvency issue with a liquidity issue. The problems, the root problems of 2008 didn't have anything to do with liquidity. That was an event that was caused by a solvency issue. What we figured out as a society is that lending people 125% of the value of a house that they couldn't afford was not a good investment. I mean, that was what it was all about. And all these guys recognized that they do it, so none of them would loan money to each other. It wasn't about liquidity to begin with. But they are dealing with the problem on a continued basis with liquidity, when the issue is in fact solvency. Does anybody in this room believe that in a society like the United States, where the on-balance sheet liabilities of the federal government are $16 trillion, the off-balance sheet liabilities of the government are, pick a number, $70 trillion? Let's call it $85 trillion in total liability. Does anybody believe that this gets better by adding $3 trillion a year in debt? That's what the response is. The second part of the response is maybe more troubling. The second reason, I think, for adding all this liquidity to the system is securities fraud. These guys couldn't sell their bonds any other way. And that's what's happening in Europe, by the way, right now. What's happening in Europe is actually pretty clever. Depositors, rational human beings, are taking their money out of the banks. And the governments are substituting credit lines to the banks. Unsecured credit lines from governments to banks. And the banks are using these credit lines to buy sovereign bonds. It's really very clever. Really very clever. Besides which, if a bank in Europe makes a loan to a living, breathing person or an entity, they have to reserve against that loan for the probability of default. But if they make a loan to a sovereign, irrespective of the creditworthiness of the sovereign or the term of the loan, they carry that loan on their books at full value. So a German bank that owns a Greek bond, where there's no possibility of repayment over 70 years, or over 30 years, pardon me, that's trading at 60% of par, gets carried on the bank's books at par. The same thing happens in this country. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong country. The same thing happens in that country. In that country, the US federal government takes between 50 and 60% in a year by way of taxes of what they spend. There's 40% left over. They raise about half of what's left over, between 20 and 25% of the federal government, the federal budget, by convincing people, often foreign, about half foreign, to buy US government bonds. But they can't sell all the bonds that they print. So they do something very clever. They have these open market operations under the guise of adding liquidity. In fact, these guys are buying their own paper. There's a word for that, a very precise word for that in English. It's counterfeiting. It isn't counterfeiting, apparently, when it's done by Caucasian people in English, according to the rule of law. It's only counterfeiting if we do it. You know, if it was such a good idea, they ought to let us do it. But they won't let us do it. The third thing that I think they're doing, and this is probably the most pernicious, is that by adding this liquidity, they're forestalling a market clearing event, and they're inspiring confidence. And I have Doug Casey to thank for this too. Doug Casey said, with regards to currency, the root word of confidence is con. And this is a true con. I mean, this is a true con. Think through this. Doug gave a conference a couple months ago where David Stockman was there. I'm not suggesting that David Stockman is a good libertarian, but neither is he anymore a battered old Republican warhorse. What David Stockman taught us is that the total federal government debt is about $85 trillion, growing, as he said, by $3 trillion a year. He said that the surplus debt service capability of the American public is in the range of $500 billion. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to write two numbers down right now. 85 trillion, that's 85 if you don't know it, followed by 12 zeros. It's a bunch of zeros. You have to have a big piece of paper to do this. And then what I want you to do is I want you to write down $500 billion. That's 500 with 9 zeros. And so that you don't have to be an economist, so you can be like me, just a credit analyst, Shylock, a speculator. Just scrape 9 zeros off each number. The proposition is that this is a household with $85,000 in debt and $500 a year in income to service the debt. This is not a pretty outcome. And what happens as a consequence of this this liquidity that's added in the system, is that people think that the system is functioning. And it is functioning. The lights come on, the SEC has their budget, everything goes on as normal. But planning your life around the fact that it's going to continue to go on requires you to believe that you can add a big column of negative numbers and come up with a positive. I would argue with you that the function of government in this circumstance is in fact to cause you to believe that you can add a column of negative numbers to get a positive number. We might argue about the utility of a market clearing event. Everybody here know what market clearing events are? And one of the beautiful things about the old Vancouver Stock Exchange is that about once every 10 years, the exchange would fall by 95%. You know, you'd have these little BS mining companies that were selling for $2 a share, and at the end of the exercise, they were selling close to their intrinsic value, let's say a dime. And that did a wonderful thing. It exposed these companies to their true value, and it also eliminated, in a temporary but efficient fashion, the specter of moral hazard. And it's moral hazard, if you will, it's Enron, that we encourage with this officially sanctioned money printing, with this fraud, with the protection that's offered up by the SEC. One of the reasons that the United States and Canada and other countries have for so many years done so well in economic development, in things like that, has been competition. I was asked the other day at the conference here in Vancouver, the Agora conference, why the export of shale technology, shale gas technology and oil technology hadn't happened. Why the exploitation of energy shales in North America was so much more vibrant and so much more vital than it was in other parts of the world. Simple answer, the technology can be exported, but what can't be exported is here in these countries as a consequence of the residual freedoms that we still enjoy, is that a problem, a technical problem, let's say in the Barnett Shale, is tackled by 40 companies or 50 companies or 60 companies. People make horrific mistakes. They drill dry holes, they have blowouts, they make all kinds of mistakes, they try technologies that fail and cost their shareholders $20 million, and occasionally they succeed. And the service providers, if you will, the intellectual connective tissue in the oil and gas business, understands over time the best practices and the worst practices, and they accumulate the best practices, they get rid of the worst practices, and over time, in this very messy process called a market, you figure out how to do something right. You optimize the process. In other parts of the world, oil and gas exploration is carried on by national oil companies. In other words, by the post office. You have a monolith that tries to employ technology. And there aren't 40 or 50 competing partners trying something and failing. They only consistently fail. There's no new ideas. The second part of our success in North America is a consequence of the fact that we have, at least in the oil and gas business, some form of the rule of law with regards to subsurface mineral rights. There's some sense that if you drill a well and make a well, and oil and gas comes back and you sell it, that you get to keep some of it. That doesn't happen so well in other jurisdictions. It's interesting to me that the lessons that we should have learned in the